here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Hey everybody, welcome inside to Adapting with Alex Garrett. This is an adapting edition because what we're about to talk about is community, is post-pandemic, is actually even Crane's business. Because my next guest, who's a friend of mine from Queens College, and I always love catching up with those who are alumnus of Queens College, who I went to school with, to see them thriving in the world. And my next guest is no different. He is a VP of Community Reinvestment, Vice President, and he's Crane's 2021 40 under 40. Oh my gosh, Jon Vazcones, congratulations on that honor alone. 40 under 40, you made the list.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was a fantastic honor. I'm just glad I was able to showcase some of the great work we've been doing, and being on a platform like that, it just allows us to to serve in the masses some of the great work that we've been able to accomplish, particularly during a troubling year like 2020.
And so how were you able to do it? And by the way, do you think that Queens College education, that experience, helped you get to be on the Crane's 40 under 40?
Yeah, so I think absolutely, right? I think Queens College was a melting pot that exposed me to different people, different thoughts, different ideas, and just being that sensitive to, the world is bigger than just my little oyster is something that's given me perspective. In a year like 2020, it was pretty evident that there was a lot of disparity, there was a lot of suffering, a lot of heartache, not just on the front lines, obviously because of the work that they're doing, but maybe beneath the covers, right? Beneath the doors and beneath sort of the shades of our neighbors. People were struggling either with food insecurity, housing insecurity, losing their jobs and employment. And so it's something that, going to Queens and being a Queens resident myself currently, and still, it's something that, I'm looking at my neighbors and I see them struggling. So anything that we can do was, top of my mind and top priority.
And you are with M&T Bank's Regional Community Reinvestment Act Officer for the Metro New York and New York, Connecticut areas, as well as so you're with M&T Bank, and how have they been able to help you help New York City, if you will?
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky. M&T Bank is going to be a top 15 bank in the country after we finish our acquisition with People's United Bank based out of Bridgeport, Connecticut this year. And it's been an opportunity for me to be able to bring my local expertise, being a New York City resident all my life, having worked in community development before coming to the bank, and obviously all the work that we were doing in Queens College. I think, I was very involved in student activities and in the community there as well. And so bringing or bridging my passions for giving back to the community, being able to now do this at a larger setting like a corporate bank like M&T has really given me the freedom to provide more resources to people that look like me and folks that work in the same places that I live and work as well.
So you deal with philanthropy, and we're getting to the community for a second too, but all of this deals with the pandemic. So investing, philanthropy, is it getting better? Is there now changes that may be forever in the investment world because of this pandemic? What have you seen? Is anything going to go back to normal, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I think, normal is a funny thing. I use this allegory pretty loosely, but what's, normal for the spider is chaos for the fly, right? And so it really depends on who we're talking about and what it looks like. I think the pandemic has really taken the veneer of, some of the underbelly of what was happening in our city with the homelessness issue, the social services that haven't been able to reach people that may have needed them. Obviously, there was a lot of food insecurity because, that was very prominent. Or the fact that people just were living paycheck to paycheck in a scale that we just didn't expect or ever imagined, right? And so as we saw unemployment increase in New York City, as we saw the homelessness, the homeless shelters begin to sort of fill up at a capacity that we just had never seen before, it really, brought to light some of the issues that were always there that were just now magnified and compounded because of the pandemic. I think post-pandemic, I'm hopeful that people will remember everything that we saw and that we may not go back to, what we considered normal, right? I think hopefully more compassion, more empathy, more understanding for our fellow New Yorker is what we look forward to coming on the other side of this. Everybody remembers banging their pots and pans and clapping at 7 p.m., and we don't do that anymore, right? And so it's having that kind of gratitude, that kind of compassion, that understanding for a fellow man. I think that's something I'm hopeful that will stay.
And how have you in the community been able to impact this community? What would you say were the highlights of your role and of being in the community this year?
Yeah, so, part of the work that I do, as you mentioned, is in philanthropy. So I was able to mobilize, dollars really quickly at the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm not sure if you remember or your audience remembers, but the first outbreak in New York State was actually in New Rochelle. It was some lawyer who had gone to some convention, and then New Rochelle was sort of locked up. And so we were able very quickly to, deploy $20,000 to parts of Westchester that were working with the school districts to help the kids get their meals, because it was the first school district in the country that actually closed, up until a few weeks ago. So it was something that we were able to do to respond fairly quickly as the pandemic began to ravage parts of northern Queens, Corona, Jackson Heights. We saw things in Brooklyn, Park Slope, Canarsie, Flatbush, and in the Bronx, obviously, the parts of Mott Haven and the South Bronx. We really were listening to what the needs were, and we understood that the needs in the Bronx were very different to the needs in Brooklyn, because the acute effects of COVID were just impacting those communities very differently. And so we were able to, provide assistance to women-owned shelters and first-time mothers in the Bronx. We were able to sort of provide philanthropic resources to food insecurity in Brooklyn, again, with the senior population there. In Staten Island, we were able to really mobilize the JCC to provide seniors with home care and home food services that, because of the pandemic, had closed their senior centers. And in the city, I was very proud to be able to support an Asian American group with some money, because they were also dealing with the xenophobia around sort of what was, coined there, the China virus, right? And so we understood that the same Asian hate we're seeing now was beginning to propagate back at the onset of the pandemic. And so we were able to respond to that fairly quickly, just to provide more resources to groups that were doing the outreach, providing sort of education, and just, giving that conversation and giving that sort of that issue some light.
Well, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this rise in hate crimes against the Asian community actually started back in February 2020, and no one really covered it back then, right? So I'm glad that you were over there. When I think about investment in philanthropy and the community, I often think about how, capitalism kind of is talked down on, right, in today's society. But what if we reinvented it to capitalism in the community? And I feel like your work is doing just that, bringing the capital into the community. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of dilemma, right? Because capitalism is fantastic for some, but by definition, it's gonna have winners and losers, right? And so, at some point, there has to be a way to make sure that the losers aren't losing as much, and maybe the winners are not winning as much. And so maybe we can bridge that divide. And so, to your point, putting capital into the community maybe helps level off, or helps all those people who are affected by capitalism in other ways receive it. So a tangible example of that is if we can give people who have been just recently fired, right, unemployed because of the pandemic, give them some assistance, give them some food vouchers. Here are some gift cards to eat at to buy at the Stop and Shop or at the local sort of convenience stores. It helps put money back into the communities, and it helps people who have been sort of economically disadvantaged because of just a situation that wasn't their fault of their own, right? It was just the circumstances that they were in. And so if we can provide them money to reinvest in their communities, or help small businesses sort of stay afloat by, giving them some philanthropic resources to give food to nurses or give food to the local shelters, it's something that, to your point, just doubles the impact, because there's more than just one winner. There's multiple winners in that case. Now,
you were able to bring funding in, but was that tough? See, I don't know. In a pandemic, everybody's a little shy to ask people to give back. So how did you guys master that? Because it was a touchy subject. Hey, can you donate to this cause during a pandemic? It was like, how do you go about asking about that?
Yeah, I think there's a fear in most people have when it's asking for something, right? Most of us, because again, to your point, the capitalist sort of the idea is like we want to be able to come out on top and to beat or to come in first. I think ultimately a lot of people are giving people. A lot of people want to give back if they're presented with an opportunity to give back, right? And so maybe it's not, I know that you got laid off. Can you give me a buck? It's, we're both laid off. Can we help each other? I have a little bit more here. You have something there. Can we sort of, work together instead of just separately? And I think giving people the opportunity to give where they can and how they can, you'd be surprised at how giving people really are.
And so it sounds like you saw a lot of that. But along with what you mentioned, the cheering has now stopped. Has the giving stopped at all now that things are sort of coming back, or do you still see the giving as strong as it was last year?
So because we're no longer in the throes of pandemic, I think it's fairly safe to say that there's been a bit of a reprieve. I'm super thrilled to sort of see the vaccination numbers in New York City increase. We've been supporting vaccination campaigns in local communities to spread the word, assuage any fears that people may have around their hesitation around the vaccine, bring doctors to communities to help, the community feel more comfortable with what's going on. So as the situation gets better, the pandemic is hopefully in the rearview mirror, right? But, every year or every 6 months, we know that there's something that's still not working, right? Well, the pandemic showed that there's food insecurity, housing insecurity, job insecurity, mental health issues. People couldn't get some of their care, right? They couldn't see their doctors. They couldn't see their families. Those issues were compounded because of the pandemic, but I don't think they've gone away because the pandemic has gotten better, right? The people who were still food insecure, or maybe a little bit less food insecure, but they still have, food needs. The seniors still need to be able to receive their home aid and health care, right? So some of these other issues are I'm happy to sort of say that, the worst of the worst, I've never seen it before, and I haven't seen it since. So things are getting better, but, there's always something else. And if you're asking me, what am I seeing in the front of, instead of looking back in the rearview mirror, what am I looking at my dashboard? Well, there's a lot of folks who have been, because of the eviction moratorium in New York State and around the country, those are folks who might be evicted in the next, 8 to 10 months once that gets lifted, right? So that's something that is top of mind. The fact that all these small businesses haven't been able to come back, I'm super thrilled that we're reopening in 2 weeks, but, some of these businesses will never come back. And so it's how do we get those entrepreneurs who lost everything, how do we get them back on their feet? And so while the pandemic ravaged and showed, the underbelly of what's happening in our city, I do think that rebuilding and fortifying New York is where the next frontier is going to be for at least philanthropy or just the bankers in the room. And,
everybody wants to bring their money to the table, if you will, for that cause, to rebuild New York. I think that's going to be great. But, yeah, with the evictions, it's terrible with small businesses. So let me ask you this. Were you there for the small business owner that didn't know how to get the SBA loan? Like, how was that role for you guys? And how can people turn to you if they still have some issues going on through this pandemic? How can people turn to you as we get into the next phase here?
Yeah, so the PPP, right, the Payroll Protection Program that was run out of the SBA, that came out of the CARES Act in 2020 as a response to the small businesses sort of flailing because of all the closures around the country. That was something that we obviously at M&T leaned heavily into. It was something that, we were very high on the list in terms of doing outreach, being able to provide the loans to the businesses that needed them, as well as sort of expanding the process to help them at this point now look for forgiveness from that loan, right? And so it was a top priority. It's something that we've been investing a lot of our time and our resources, both in terms of providing educational content, but again, walking business owners through that process, which can be cumbersome. I think people forget that the legislation was built or was finished on a Thursday, and by that Monday, the floodgates opened, right? And so
it crashed.
Because of that, yeah, it was a little touch and go because, again, we were just building the plans, we were flying them. But I think at this point in the process, we're still sort of getting more guidance from the government. There's a lot of coordination around how to help businesses. And so there's more programs now. I think philanthropy is also helping in that space. I saw a lot of companies like Verizon and Lowe's put in a lot of money to give grants, so not even a loan, just give free money to small businesses. And it's something that we did as well, just to help them, get to that next payroll if it made sense.
And and so do you think the PPE and all these loans start continue? Do you think these stimulus packages continue, or are they dying down now?
No, I think, there needs to be more stimulus, right? I think there needs to be more support for our small businesses, for our farmers, for all of our agricultural sort of, growers and producers. That's something that doesn't get talked about, right? Like the farm industry was also ravaged. People weren't buying at the levels because the restaurants were closed, right? And so there was a butterfly effect across every single sector, right? Tourism, whatever you name it, it had such an indelible impact that it was very clear that the airlines had to survive, that some of the hotels had to survive as well. And so that's what it was priority for the first iteration of the CARES Act. I think as we're getting through the pandemic, the question now becomes, how do we revitalize some of these areas? You've seen it. You go downtown in Midtown or in parts of the city, and it's still quiet. It's still dead. And so the question is, how do we get folks in there? How do we get small businesses back in there? How do we get people the purchasing power to put it back into their communities? And I think it's through some more support. And
I'm sure M&T is going to be at the front line. Have you had any engagement with the federal government on this? Like, how has M&T actually worked with the feds to get funding out there?
So we work through our, associations and through our relationships. We have conversations, but in terms of direct lobbying, that's beyond my scope. I'm not really sure to tell you, Alex, but I do know that we're consistently advocating with our peer banks to speak to sort of the needs in our communities. And it's very clear that just because the infection rates are going down, the effects of the pandemic haven't necessarily ended. I think it's fair to say that the world hasn't gone back to how it was, a year and a half ago now. So whether we can sort of debate how much money and where does it go to and who gets it, I think that's the second step. I think the first step is convincing people that more aid is needed.
Well, that's how do we convince them? Because I know a lot of people are very anti-stimulus now, or worry that's going to be a government dependency thing. And I hate to say lean toward that, but I do want people to be on their own 2 feet as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so the question then becomes how do you think we can get there, right? And so I have a lot of ideas, right? Like, do we provide entrepreneurship grants, right, to small business owners who lost their business and now want to do something else, right? So if you were a small deli, bodega, mom-and-pop shop in Brooklyn and you had to close because you couldn't afford the rent and you couldn't afford your payroll to pay your folks, you clearly were a strong business owner before. Maybe if we gave you the resources to start a second business, it would help you then employ 5 or 6 people in the community just like you were before. So, I understand the argument against disincentivizing people to work because of stimulus, but one of the things people forget is that they're taxed on that money too. So whatever federal relief that people get, it's taxed, right? If you get unemployment, you have to pay taxes on it. If you get some of these loans from the bank, PPP loans, you either have to pay them back or you have to prove that you were able to use them to the fullest extent that allowed them to get forgiven. So with every give you, there's a gotcha. And so I'd be remiss to sort of say that stimulus doesn't mean just give away money and then people just buy Dogecoin or whatever it is. I think it's we're talking about the folks who have been really seriously impacted, who are needing money for food or for housing or for medication. And those are the folks we really want to target, if at all.
Well, and the work's never done. So, Jon, thanks so much for joining me today on this. And I think it is a big part of the adapting role, right? Because you guys are helping people adapt in the community.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me this morning with you or today with you. It's fantastic. I think adapting is something that makes total sense, and it's something that we need to look towards the future for, right? So if we want to adapt towards how things were before, I think it's clear that it's not working. So if we're going to adapt, we need to have one eye on one eye looking forward, one eye seeing where we've come from, but we need to move forward in that direction.
I guess one of the things to ask you is, how have you eased people's emotional worries?
Around?
Well, around the around everything, because a lot of people got emotionally distressed too. So your clientele, they started to come to the beginning of this. How did you allay their fears, if you will, as we move through this?
Well, I think that the first thing is that I don't have all the answers, and I am just the same as you, right? Like, I have the same insecurities. I have the same fears. I was worried about getting COVID. I was worried about my family getting COVID. I was worried about being laid off. I was worried about all the same things that everybody's worried about, right? So I think that's the first thing, that there was nobody who knew how to get through this in any which way. We were all in it together. And I have to be very candid with you, Alex, that in those first 3 to 4 months, I want to say between like March and June, like there was so much uncertainty, so much insecurity, so much anxiety around what this meant, how long this was going to go for. The pandemic was supposed to be a 2-week closure that ended up being now for months. And we were looking at each other like, is this the last time we're seeing each other in person? Or is this the last time we'll have gone to the world that we knew it? So I think that's the first thing. Like, I was sympathetic because I was in the same shoes as somebody else. My folks were also laid off, right? Like, my friends and family were on unemployment because they needed to, because it was no fault of their own, right? So I understood. And having that compassion and that empathy is what allowed us to create an equitable solution to some of these issues. Like, these are the issues that are affecting this particular community. And I understand that. And that answer for that community is going to be different to an answer for a different community. The needs of Flushing were completely different to the needs of, Upper Manhattan. And we absolutely understood that. And so we have to talk about the nuance when it comes to sort of, what are people's fears and anxieties and that mental health, right? So if you were living with your elderly parents, you were worried about them, right? You were worried about their health. If you had young kids, you were worried about them. And so it really comes down to just having that humanity and adapting to, my job is not a banker. My job is as a human being to help this other person. And how do I do that to the best of my ability?
Well, I look forward to hearing more about this, actually, as we go through the day. So come back and tell me more about what you're doing as the VP of Community Investment at M&T Bank. Jonathan, from Queens to now, it's so cool to see you thriving and moving along, and it's just fun to catch up, So thanks for being out there for us.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Thank you, John, and happy 8th anniversary with M&T Bank. Can't wait to have you come back. And yes, here at Alex Garrett Podcasting, we're always adapting.